Hey there, Knicks fans. How you doing? It's your boy, Jonathan Macri, with you for another episode of the Knicks Film School Podcast. Recording at 8 o'clock on, see if I can keep track of my days, on Tuesday night. Sad day. A sad day in Knicks land for anyone, whether you are a 10-year-old Knicks fan or, 80-year-old Knicks fan or anyone in between. You probably heard of the name Willis Reed, and we lost him today at the age of 80. And to talk a little bit about it, as those of you who have listened to me for a while know that I am old, but I'm not quite old enough to remember Mr. Reed. The person I have on is not old. Be very clear about that. He's not old, but he's old enough to have a little bit of a recollection. Ray Marcano, how are you, sir?
All right, how you doing? That is a very, very polite way of saying he's not quite eligible for Social Security yet. So thank you.
Anytime. So I love any excuse to get to pick your brain about NBA history. This is not one I'm thrilled to do because Willis has been, he's been in both of our lives, since I can remember. And I guess since you could remember as well. And I don't know, this wasn't really on I understand he wasn't at the recent celebration of the 75th anniversary team. This wasn't really on my radar, even though it probably should have been. So it kind of came out of left field and, just got done thinking about the 75th anniversary season and, ranking the top players and the whole thing. So I'll just start off by asking you, as someone who, well, actually, here's where I should start off. What are your earliest recollections of Willis Reed?
Well, there were two. One is from my grandfather, who was the most important male figure of my life, by far and away, not even close. And his favorite Knick player was not Clyde, was not Earl, was not DeBusschere. It was Willis Reed. And I remember as a kid asking him why Willis Reed was his favorite Knicks player. And he said, because he's a man. Now, this comes from a guy, my grandfather, who got up every morning, drove 45 minutes from the Bronx into New Jersey to cut meat every day by hand. And he would come home every evening, his hands and feet so sore, because he stood up during the entire thing. So his feet were sore, his hands were swollen. He couldn't, on many occasions, grab his hands. He was hurting so bad. And he says, Willis Reed is the definition of a man. I'll never forget that. That's number one. Number two, of course, was the game, right? 1970. So I was like a 10-year-old kid, not 50-year-old, John, 10 years old. And so, we had those little transistor radios back then. And I remember I'm hearing Marv Albert's voice, right? And then all of a sudden, I think I'm hearing static. Well, as it turns out, it's not static. It's the Garden crowd roaring, because here comes Willis Reed on his one leg, limping and gimping through, and just sends the crowd into frenzy. It took me about 2 minutes to understand that was cheering. So those are the two biggest. And, of course, everybody has a 70 Reed moment burned in their brain, because it's obviously one of the top, 5 iconic sports moments in all of sports history. Everybody knows that.
It has to be. Now you got me thinking. I wasn't prepared to go into that sort of. That it might be. Is there a more iconic New York sports moment, like one moment, and a more iconic New York sports moment? I'm sure there's something. Ruth's called shot or
nothing. And here's why. Because ever since Reed did that, came out on the floor in the 1970 game 7, anytime any athlete tries to do something similar, what do they call it? They call it a Willis Reed moment.
Yep.
When a ball player hits a big home run, you don't hear a Babe Ruth moment. You see, it's probably my bourbon, and I haven't even had that much. If a hockey player scores a goal, you don't hear a Wayne Gretzky. No. You don't hear that. But if you see a player limping out, when Kirk Gibson hit that home run, was a Willis Reed moment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great call. So, yeah, I mean, well, anyway, you were saying, so everybody has their own, 1970. What is when you think of other than that, when you think of the 1970 Knicks or just those Knicks because there's 2 championships, what comes to mind?
Reed, and this is why. A lot of people, history is history, right? And a lot of people just simply don't remember history. So the year before, in the 68-69 season, the Knicks lost to the Celtics, right? And the Celtics go on to win the championships. If the Knicks beat the Celtics, that would have been a hell of a series with the Lakers. Who knows how that would have turned out. And then, of course, you have 73. But what happens after 1973? Right. And because he retires in 74, he's 31 years old, 9 seasons. Right. So that season, 74-75 season, the Knicks have their core back. Right.
Other than Reed. Yeah.
Other than Reed. Right. They got everybody. They've got, not the Busher. He retired.
I was about to say DeBuscher's gone too.
DeBuscher's gone too. But they still have Clyde and Monroe and Jim Barnett. And I'm missing a couple of other people. Bradley.
I was about, and oh my God, the another top 75 all-time player, the guy who used to play for the Royals. His name I always forget.
Cassie Russell.
No, not Cassie Russell.
Not Cassie Russell. No.
Jerry Lucas. There we go. Jerry Lucas was still there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, Jerry Lucas. So they're all there, but they go 43-39, I think, and don't make the playoffs. 4 out of the next 5 years, they don't make the playoffs. And what that always told me was that even though Reed was underrated when he should not have been, because he was very quiet, he was very unassuming, he always carried himself in a professional manner. That guy was the glue of those Knicks teams from the late 60s to the mid 70s. And when he left, that had an indelible impact on that team for, as we can see by their record, for the next 5 years. I mean, who knows how well that team could have done if Willis Reed played his 32, 33, 34 seasons.
So you were doing it from memory pretty damn good. You were off by, I think, 1 game. That team was 40-42. And they lost in the first round of the playoffs. In the 6 years leading up to that, and this is kind of what you were alluding to and what I think people have an idea of, but I don't know if people actually know the actual, like the fact, 6 straight conference finals, or at one point in time it was called the division finals, but like it was basically 6 straight times they either made it to the finals, where they made it 3 times, of course losing once to the Lakers, and then the other 3 times they made it as far as they could in the East. In the 48 years since, I guess, the franchise has been back to the conference finals or further 4 times. So we had 6 times in 6 years, and then 4 times in, again, whatever it is, 48 years. And then as I was kind of doing some digging today for the newsletter, in the decade preceding Reed's arrival, but really if you want to focus on those 5 years, and I know this is going back probably a little bit before your time. I mean, I don't know, my daughter's over here, so I don't want to curse too loud, but you want to talk about dog shit? I mean, they were the worst. Certainly the worst franchise in professional basketball, if not the worst franchise. It was just, hopeless, going nowhere. And then he came and he was the first guy. So I can't imagine what it must have been like to kind of take on that responsibility in an era where, and again, I'll lean back on you for this one, the center position was just like, and that's what the other thing I was thinking about it today. I'm like, well, wait a minute. So this Hall of Famer played during this time, and this Hall of Famer, and this Hall of Famer, and this Hall of Famer, and this top 75, and this top 75 guy, and this MVP, and this MVP. Well, wait a minute. So if there's only 12 or 14 teams, every other night you're playing against a guy who was probably the odds are making the Hall of Fame.
You played against a beast, and I could talk about Willis Reed for an hour, so I'll try to be brief. But let's just step back for a second and go to the 1964 draft, because,
sure,
if the Knicks, it's quite possible the Knicks could never have gotten him, because remember, he was picked in the second round.
Greatest second round pick. Greatest second. All due respect to
second round pick.
All the other, right? Greatest second round pick ever.
Their first pick was Jim Bad News Barnes, who didn't even make it past out of his second season, if I remember correctly.
He was involved. I'll look it up, but I think he was involved in a significant trade to get somebody. I'll look it up.
He was. I wrote that in my Nick You Knew.
Yes, you did. Yeah, there you go. Shout out to you.
There I go, tooting my own horn.
It's a good horn to toot.
Anyway, so 64, and then look at the years he has. After that, rookie of the year, he becomes the first player ever. Was his first player ever in 1970? I believe he won the MVP in the All-Star game,
and the
MVP game.
Yep.
He won all 3 MVPs, triple crown of MVPs. He won that year. But he also did something that goes wildly and unfortunately unnoticed in history. Right. So here we are. This is in the mid 60s. We all know what the country's civil rights and racial animus is during that particular time. And the Knicks, to their credit, were one of the few teams that were a fairly integrated bunch. And Willis Reed kept that together.
What do you mean by that?
Well, here's what I mean by that. I'll try to tell this story quickly, but there's a famous story in which Cassie Russell, this is why Cassie Russell was on my mind. He was with the Knicks at the time. He was on the way to a ball game. I think it was in Detroit. He gets stopped by cops, right? And he gets stopped by cops because a black guy with a beard had just busted out of jail somewhere near wherever he got stopped. Of course, he's a black guy with a beard. So what happens? He gets arrested, right? Understandably, Cassie Russell's pissed. So he goes to practice that day. And what he starts doing is he starts elbowing his white teammates.
Well,
because he's just so pissed. And Willis Reed says, dude, what are you doing? Well, Cassie Russell, unfortunately, you can look this up. I mean, anybody can find this story online, I think. Cassie Russell calls Willis Reed an Uncle Tom.
Well,
now, one black man saying that to another black man who grew up in the segregated South, went to a segregated high school, went to an all-black college. Oh, my God. What's Willis Reed do? He walks up to him very quietly, and he says, if you don't stop this Uncle Tom is going to kick your ass. And Cassie Russell shut it down. Why did he shut it down? Willis Reed's a bad man.
I was about to say he was not a small man.
He was a bad man. He was one of the strongest men in the NBA. Probably one of the strongest men. I was trying to think about this. Who was in that? Probably like a Ben Wallace type might be Willis Reed of that generation. Because Ben Wallace was just a beast.
Even for that time when I don't think the center, Wilt obviously had already come through and Wilt was massive and Kareem is taller than he ever lets on. But that for that time, he was, I think, undersized, which is part of why, and this is going to bring it back to Jim Bad News Barnes. Barnes was traded for Bellamy because, and which is funny because people think like, oh, they drafted, Reed and they tried to make the Twin Towers thing work because Bellamy was, no, they went out and got Bellamy, there was no one, and as you could say, as you know, no uncertain terms, he was the center. So they figured Reed could be the power forward. And then they tried that for a few years and they did okay, but obviously the Busher was a bit of a better fit anyway. So yeah, he was undersized in terms of height, but in terms of everything else,
girth. The guy, if you go back and take a look at some of those old videos in which Reed is guarding Chamberlain, Reed was able to do something that no other center in basketball was able to do, and that's move Chamberlain off the lower block.
Yeah.
Nobody could do that because Wilt Chamberlain arguably is the strongest human being ever to play basketball anywhere on the planet. Willis Reed could, though.
Combination of strength and he had everything, strength, agility, the whole thing. I was doing before my lovely wife, Dolores, several years ago, got me as a gift, a New York Times, a compilation of all articles over the all about the Knicks over the course of that the Times have been covering them. And I went back before and I was reading the recaps after both of the championships, the next morning, and all the on and on and on about Reed's defense on Chamberlain in both of those, and how that was the biggest deal in the game. In
the 73 series, championship series.
Yep.
The only game that Chamberlain was completely dominant was the one game Reed could not play in its entirety in Game 6. Now, Chamberlain had great games, great games for any normal player, very good games for Wilt Chamberlain for the other 7 games. But otherwise,
you're talking about 70 now. 70,
yes. 70. Yes, I'm sorry, 70. But Reed was able to hold him in check. There were a couple of games, actually, where Chamberlain, strangely, shot less than 50% because of what Reed was able to do and pushing him back out of his comfort zone on the offensive end.
Yeah, and I think people think of Wilt during that time as a guy, he wasn't the offensive force that he once was. And granted, the prodigious numbers didn't quite match up, but still averaged 27 a game in that 69-70 season. And when he needed to, and again, I think the game that you're referencing is Game 6 when he put up these are not even real numbers. 45 points on 27 shots. He was 20 of 27 and 27 rebounds. That was without Reed in the lineup at all. But in the games before that, starting with Game 1, 17, 19, 21, 18, 22, and then in Game 7, just 21 points. Again, for a guy like this, Wilt Chamberlain we're talking about. The last thing I just want to ask you, and then you tough this out long enough. I'm not gonna subject you to much more, but
you're good.
I did my top 75 list for top 75 Knicks last year. I ended up ranking Reed 3rd, and I did legitimately go back and forth about it. There was a point where I'm like, man, should Willis Reed be number 1? And I really grappled with it, and I had to make a decision, and I ultimately put him 3rd. And I gave my reasoning, and I ended up having Frazier 2nd and Ewing 1st. And I can't tell you how many people reached out to me with, and I reference this in tomorrow's newsletter, with some version of I get your argument, Jonathan, but if you were there and you saw it and you watch this man play every day, every game, year in and year out, you would know, this is the greatest Knick in history. And what was it that about him that the numbers, just couldn't, or the accolades or anything couldn't quite capture?
I think it's his presence. He had, if you were going to rank Knicks all time by pure presence, then Willis Reed's number 1, and there's not even anybody who's close. But he was the entire package. Quiet, determined, a leader, someone who could lead any man, regardless of who they were, and who any man in the 1960s and early 1970s respected. Think of how unusual that is. I mean, even Bill Russell, for the presence that he was, often got pushback from a lot of people, but Willis Reed never did. He handled New York media. He was very polite with everybody. So hindsight being everything that it is, I don't have any quibble or quarrel with, Ewing, Frazier, Reed, because everything's hindsight, right? Yeah. You got different eras. You know that stuff. You got different eras and all that stuff. You got to try to figure out. But in terms of if you were looking at the player that has meant the most to the New York Knicks in their history, if you were ranking it that way, then Willis Reed's number 1.
Well, 70 was now year 70. Yeah, 76. Only one man has ever the voting body who decides these things look at and say, you, New York Knick, are the best player in the sport. And that Willis Reed, one MVP, obviously, and then obviously the 2 finals MVPs. I lied. One last one, only because you've written a lot about this era, and I think it's an era that interests you, which is the late 70s with the Knicks when Reed was coach. And he attempted to coach this band of, I don't know what else to say other than this band of misfit toys that they had tried to assemble based on talent. And boy, was there talent on that team. I mean, former MVP, Bob McAdoo, to say nothing of some of the other guys on that squad. What do you remember about that time? And Reed's attempt to, again, try to coach a squad that was very different from the one that he led to a title, 2 titles.
It's a shit show. It's the only way to put it.
Tell me how you really feel.
I mean, I think it was a classic case of a very good man who had no business, and a very smart basketball
player, sure, yeah,
who had no business coaching that group of players. I mean, I'm trying to think of an analogy. It would be here we go. It would kind of be like Red Auerbach trying to coach Stephon Marbury and Stevie Francis. I mean, it's just not going to work. And, no. Reed was a player who tried to coach like he played. Hard, determined, bullish, but didn't have a team for that. And they, the Knicks, I think the Knicks screwed that up because the next season they fired him 14 games into the season. Yeah. I believe that's the number.
You nailed it. 14 games. Very good.
And, it's that was just stupid. If you're going to give and by the way, the New York fans gave the Knicks all kinds of shit about that at the time because they figure you're going to hire an icon. Oh, yeah, you're going to hire an icon, not because of his performance, because it was an icon thing. If you're going to hire an icon, give the icon a chance. Don't shit on the icon. The Knicks shit on the icon. But the Knicks were doing Knicksy things.
As they have been wanting to do over the years. Ray, I can't thank you enough. I'm obligated to ask you if there's anything you want to plug or promote. Can I, or otherwise I can plug something for you if you want.
I do want to plug something. I want to plug Patreon and the Knicks Film School podcast and newsletter. If you are not getting the Knicks Film School if you're not getting the Knicks Film School newsletter or listening to the Knicks Film School podcast, you are missing out on the smartest, best, most detailed New York's Knicks information on the planet, not only from your host, John Macri, but from people like Jeremy Cohen, Andrew Claudio, Benji Ritzholz, and a host of others that you can see right here on this screen or by reading it every day from Knicks Film School.
Right. You're supposed to plug something that you do. I don't know. I know you've been in this business for a while, right? But so maybe no one ever explained.
But let me ask you, wasn't that damn good for off the top of my head? As a matter of fact, if you want, you can just go ahead and clip that and just start playing it.
That's the check's in the mail, Ray. Ray Marcano, he's an award-winning journalist for decades upon decades, and has far more accolades than he has any business sitting here talking to me. But what I want to say is, if you like bourbon, go over to Substack and you could read his newsletter on Substack, which is called The Bourbon Resource. And I think you could probably just find that. You should link that on your Twitter. Do you have that on your Twitter? You should. I
think I don't know. I might. I'll take a look.
Google Bourbon Resource Substack, Ray Marcano. It's a great read, and if you like bourbon, it's an invaluable resource. That's the only thing I'll say.
Great seeing you, my friend.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, brother.